You've been wondering why it takes so long. Why the scales never seem to tip while they're in their prime, collecting admiration, leaving wreckage behind you, and walking away untouched. You watch them win over and over, and it makes you question reality itself. But here's the quiet truth you've been waiting to hear. The delay isn't a denial. It's an accumulation. And the heavy truth of it is already moving toward them. You feel it in your bones when they slip through another consequence. You feel it when the people around them cheer, completely blind to the quiet manipulation running underneath every practiced smile and every carefully curated story. It leaves a hollow ache in your chest, doesn't it? That lingering sense that justice is just a pretty word used by people who never had to actually survive them. But what if the timeline was never yours to manage? The question isn't whether they'll face what they built. The question is why it arrives so late, when the stage is dim and the mirrors are cracked. You deserve clarity on this, because the silence around it has cost you years of restless sleep. The truth is simple but heavy. They don't pay when they're strong. They pay when the armor finally rusts. And rust doesn't appear overnight. It takes decades of ignoring the rain. Think about how long they sustained the illusion. The endless networking, the charm offensive, the way they bent every room to orbit around their voice. It required energy. Immense, relentless, almost mechanical energy. But youth forgives a lot of friction. Youth provides fresh faces, new stages, and endless audiences willing to buy the performance. You weren't watching a person. You were watching a machine running on borrowed time. You stayed awake trying to figure them out. You replayed conversations, searching for the exact moment the kindness turned to ice. You asked yourself why someone could look at you, speak with such absolute certainty, and yet leave you feeling completely erased. But their behavior wasn't a mystery you failed to solve. It was a blueprint they were following all along. And blueprints eventually run out of ink. Karma isn't a sudden strike from the heavens. It's not a lightning bolt punishing them for a single cruel word. It's gravity. It's the slow, inevitable return of everything they refuse to carry. You've spent years feeling light while they carried the spotlight, but gravity was working beneath your feet the entire time. Now the floor is shifting. Now the weight is returning. And it's landing exactly where it was meant to. You notice it first in the small things. The friends who stop calling. The family members who suddenly find busy schedules. The colleagues who look away when they speak a little too loudly. These aren't random shifts. They're quiet withdrawals. People don't announce they're leaving. They just stop showing up. And the silence they leave behind becomes the loudest echo in the room. You've seen it. I know you have. The real question you've been holding on to is painful, but necessary. Why does it have to wait until they're old to finally hurt? Why does it take until their body betrays them, until their energy drains, until the charm loses its grip on reality? Because age strips away the tools. Age removes the stagehands. And when the lights dim, you finally see what was hiding in the dark all along. The performance ends. The truth remains. You weren't imagining the imbalance. You weren't exaggerating the damage. You were just living inside a timeline they controlled, while the real clock was ticking somewhere else. They thought they were outrunning accountability. They thought youth was a permanent shield. But youth isn't armor. Youth is just a temporary curtain. And curtains always fall when the show is over. What happens next is where the real reckoning begins. So stay with me here. Because what comes next isn't about vengeance. It's about understanding the mechanics of what you survived. It's about watching the illusion crack without stepping back into the fire. You don't need to chase them anymore. You don't need to beg the universe for proof. The proof is already moving. It's just taking its time. And time, as it always does, will settle the debt. Inside them, there was never peace. Only the frantic need to outrun a hollow space that no amount of applause could ever fill. You felt that emptiness when you got close, didn't you? That sudden chill beneath the warmth. They didn't build lives. They built mirrors. Every compliment, every victory, every person they conquered was just glass reflecting a version of themselves they desperately needed to believe was real. Narcissism isn't arrogance. That's what they want you to think. Arrogance is confidence turned up too loud. Narcissism is terror turned inside out. It's a panic so deep it disguises itself as control. You were dealing with someone who couldn't tolerate their own shadow, so they handed you a flashlight and told you to keep looking at theirs. You burned out trying. Not because you were weak. Because the task was impossible. Every relationship they touched was a transaction wrapped in poetry. You gave loyalty. They took inventory. You offered vulnerability. They filed it away for future leverage. It sounds cold when you say it plainly, but it wasn't malice in the traditional sense. It was survival. A fractured system protecting itself by consuming everything around it. You weren't a person to them. You were fuel. And fuel eventually runs out. You keep wondering why they never changed. Why the apologies sounded scripted. Why the promises always dissolved into thin air. Here's the quiet truth. They didn't have the architecture to rebuild. Change requires humility. Humility requires a core. They don't have one. They have a mask. And when you spend decades gluing a mask to your face, you eventually forget how to breathe beneath it. The suffocation comes later. The mind adapts to survive its own chaos. When you refuse to feel guilt, your brain rewires to justify everything. When you refuse accountability, reality bends to protect you. It's not evil. It's adaptation. A psychological pressure valve hissing steam so loudly that no one else gets a word in. You thought you were arguing with a person. You were actually arguing with a defense system. And systems don't heal. They escalate. You remember the charm, right? That magnetic pull that made you question your own instincts. It wasn't genuine warmth. It was a hunting rhythm. Calibrate. Secure. They learned early that people respond to brightness, so they painted themselves in gold. But gold tarnishes. Light fades. And when you spend a lifetime performing brilliance, you forget how to sit in the ordinary. Ordinary becomes unbearable. Isolation begins. The hidden motive was never about hurting you. It was about never feeling small. Every put-down, every silent treatment, every sudden withdrawal was just a frantic attempt to keep the hierarchy intact. You were the mirror, and they couldn't stand seeing the cracks. So they shattered the glass. They walked over you to avoid feeling grounded. But the ground doesn't care about your pride. The ground always wins. Eventually, you carried the emotional weight so they wouldn't have to. You absorbed the tension. You swallowed the confusion. You apologized for boundaries you had every right to hold. That was the design. A gravitational pull that dragged your empathy into their vacuum until you were orbiting a void. But physics doesn't stop working just because someone ignores it. What goes unacknowledged doesn't disappear. It compounds. It waits. They thought they were clever. Thought they were outmaneuvering human nature itself. But human nature is patient. It keeps ledgers in the nervous systems of everyone they touched. Every discarded promise, every weaponized silence, every manipulated tear, it all gets recorded. Not by magic. By memory. By the slow erosion of trust that leaves them standing alone in rooms they built with lies. You knew it. You always knew it. Understanding their psychology doesn't excuse them. It just frees you from the illusion that they had a choice. They didn't. They were trapped in a loop of their own making, feeding on validation like a starving animal. You were the meal. Now the season changes. Now the forest dries up. And the predator who never learned how to forage for themselves is about to face the quietest, heaviest hunger imaginable. The reckoning begins internally. Then comes the shift. Subtle at first. A missed invitation. A phone call that goes to voicemail. A room that used to hold its breath now breathes normally. They don't notice it immediately. They assume it's a phase. They've weathered phases before. They double down on the old tricks. The charm tightens. The demands grow louder. But the echo is gone. And you can't fake an echo when the canyon has moved. You'd almost feel sorry for them if you hadn't carried their weight. But pity isn't owed to someone who weaponized your empathy. Watch closely now. Watch how they scramble when the audience thins. How the laughter they once controlled suddenly feels heavy in their own throat. How they realize the scripts aren't working anymore. The director walked away. The crew packed up. And they're standing center stage in an empty theater. It accelerates when they notice their reflection doesn't flatter them anymore. Not just physically. Psychologically. The eyes that used to spark with superiority now search for reassurance. The voice that commanded rooms now cracks at the edges. They try to buy back the loyalty. They try to rewrite history. They offer sudden generosity, late apologies, unexpected tears. But desperation has a different scent. People smell it. You see this happen from a distance now. You don't need to be in the room to feel the temperature drop. Their old tactics bounce off people who have simply grown tired. Not angry, just tired. Exhaustion is a quiet boundary. And when 1,000 people set it at once, the wall becomes a fortress. They knock. They rattle the door. They demand entry. But the lock changed years ago. They just never read the memo. There's a specific moment you'll recognize. Maybe it already passed you by. It's when the rage stops sounding dangerous and starts sounding desperate. The insults lose their precision. The manipulation gets clumsy. The grandstanding trips over its own feet. You used to brace for impact. Now you just watch. And in that watching, something unlocks in your nervous system. The spell breaks. The giant is just a tired person. Power doesn't vanish. It transfers. It leaves the loud mouth and settles in the quiet spine of everyone who survived them. They feel that transfer like a physical loss. Like a limb going numb. They lash out because numbness feels worse than pain. But pain is temporary. Numbness is the beginning of the end. You're no longer the target. You're just a witness to a machine finally overheating. The gears grind. The smoke rises. Watch how they treat service workers now. The people who can't offer them status. Watch how they handle medical appointments, legal paperwork, mundane responsibilities that can't be outsourced to charm. They don't know how to ask without demanding. They don't know how to receive without owning. The mask slips because the hands are shaking. And shaking hands can't hold a crown. It was never real anyway. You always saw that. The turning point isn't loud. It's quiet. It's the day they realize the narrative they've been running is no longer being followed. No one is fact-checking their stories. No one is feeding their drama. The supply line is cut. Panic sets in quietly. It doesn't announce itself. It just sits in their chest like a stone. You used to carry that stone for them. Now it's finally resting where it belongs. On their own chest. They'll try one last grand gesture. A public post. A dramatic declaration. A manufactured crisis designed to pull you back into the orbit. You'll feel the pull, just for a second. Old wiring fires. But you don't have to follow the current. You can watch the water recede instead. Let them call out to ghosts. Let them bargain with shadows. The real power move is doing absolutely nothing. Silence is the final verdict. And then it stops. Just like that. The chase ends. The performance collapses under its own weight. They stand in the wreckage of their own making, waiting for someone to clean it up, and realize there's no one left on the clock. You don't need to say anything. The silence speaks for every word you swallowed, every tear you hid, every piece of yourself you gave away. The stage is dark. The house lights turn on. The collapse doesn't happen all at once. It's a slow unraveling of everything they use to anchor their identity. Friends fade into polite distance. Family stops sharing holidays. Colleagues remember their old behavior with quiet regret. They don't understand why the room went quiet. They blame everyone else. Always everyone else. But isolation isn't a punishment handed down. It's the natural result of burning every bridge you crossed. Watch the financial reality catch up. The debts they ignored because they believed the next windfall would erase them. The assets they drained trying to maintain appearances. The accounts frozen, the properties sold, the sudden panic of counting every dollar. Money wasn't just currency to them. It was control. It was validation. When it slips through their fingers, they don't just lose wealth. They lose the illusion that they were untouchable. The body starts telling truths the mind refused to hear. Aches that won't fade. Energy that won't return. The sudden realization that they can't outrun time anymore. They tried to weaponize youth, but youth expires. Now they're sitting in a room with nothing but the quiet hum of their own breathing. No applause. No distractions. Just the steady, unrelenting presence of everything they spent decades avoiding. Themselves. You'd think they'd reflect. That's what you'd hope, right? But the mind that spent a lifetime deflecting doesn't suddenly turn inward when the walls close in. It doubles down on bitterness. The anger sharpens into a permanent posture. The jaw tightens. The eyes narrow. They become prisoners of their own resentment. You don't need to visit them to know what that looks like. You've seen the mask calcify. It's a heavy thing to wear forever. The children distance themselves. Not out of cruelty, out of preservation. They learned early that love was conditional. That affection required performance. That safety was an illusion. So they pack their boundaries and walk. They send cards occasionally. They call on holidays. But they never return. And that's the deepest cut. Not the loss of money or status. The loss of blood. The quiet realization that they engineered their own loneliness. They start keeping lists of everyone who left. Not to learn. Not to grow. To prove a point to a room that isn't there anymore. They rehearse conversations with ghosts. They rewrite history in journals no one will read. It's tragic in a way. But not your tragedy. You're not responsible for their hollow halls. You're only responsible for remembering why you left. And why staying would have killed the best parts of you. The real hurt isn't what they do to others at this stage. It's what they do to themselves. The sleepless nights staring at ceilings. The sudden panic in crowded rooms. The desperate grasp for a reflection that doesn't recognize them back. They're drowning in the very waters they poured. You don't need to save them. You can't pour empathy into a bottomless well and expect it to hold water. It never will. It was built to leak. You'll hear stories about them. Rumors of decline. Whispers about their condition. People will ask if you feel vindicated. If you feel peace. But vindication is just another hook. And you've already unhooked yourself. You don't need their downfall to validate your survival. You survived because you chose to. The truth was in your bones long before the world caught up to it. You just had to stop doubting yourself. The consequences aren't dramatic. They're quiet. They're in the empty chair at the table. The silent phone. The unopened mail. The mirror that stops lying. They wanted a life without friction. They built a life without depth. And depth is what keeps you anchored when the storm comes. They have no anchor. Just the endless drift of a ship with no compass, sailing into waters it doesn't understand. The ocean doesn't care. It just receives. This is the part where they finally understand gravity. Not as a concept. As a sensation. The heavy pull of a life lived sideways. The exhaustion of pretending to be solid when you were always hollow. The sting of realizing that every shortcut was just a debt. And the bill arrives exactly when you can no longer outrun the collector. It hurts. It's supposed to. Not because you wanted it to. Because truth always burns before it heals. You're still here. That's the first truth you need to hold on to. You walked through fire and didn't burn down. You carried their chaos and didn't lose your center. The exhaustion you feel isn't failure. It's the aftermath of holding a line they swore was impossible to cross. You crossed it anyway. Not with force. With endurance. With a quiet, stubborn refusal to let their reality overwrite yours. That takes a kind of courage most people never learn. Let yourself rest. Not the performative rest. The real kind. The kind where you stop scanning rooms for tension. The kind where you stop editing your words before speaking them. The kind where your nervous system finally believes the war is over. It is. The battlefield was never your home. It was just a place you passed through on your way to yourself. You're allowed to put the armor down. You're allowed to breathe again. You don't have to forgive them to heal. That's a myth sold to people who want the past wrapped in a bow. Forgiveness isn't a requirement. Peace is. And peace doesn't come from rewriting their story. It comes from owning yours. You get to keep the pieces that served you. The wisdom. The boundaries. The fierce clarity that only comes after surviving a storm. Leave the guilt at the door. It never belonged to you anyway. Watch how your relationships change now. How the people who truly love you show up without conditions. How the conversations feel lighter. How silence doesn't feel like punishment anymore. This is what happens when you stop carrying someone else's heavy gravity. The world recalibrates. The right people step forward. The noise finally fades. You hear your own voice again. And it's stronger than you remember. It always was. They will keep their collapse to themselves. Let them. You don't need to witness it to believe in it. Justice doesn't require your attendance. It only requires your absence from the fire. Step back completely. Breathe deeply. Let the timeline unfold without your hands on the wheel. The universe has a quiet way of settling accounts when you stop trying to balance them yourself. Trust the math. Trust yourself. You're not waiting for an apology that will never come. You're building a life that doesn't need one. That's the real victory. Not their downfall. Your rise. The slow, deliberate rebuilding of a nervous system that finally feels safe. The reclamation of joy that doesn't require permission. The quiet mornings, the unguarded laughter, the freedom of walking into rooms without bracing for impact. That's yours. No one can take it. Look at your hands. They're steady now. They used to tremble under the weight of their expectations. They used to shake while drafting texts you'd never send. They used to clutch invisible burdens just to keep the peace. Look at them again. They're creating. They're holding space for people who deserve it. They're finally resting in your lap when you read. That's not luck. That's survival earned through sheer persistence. The karma they face isn't about punishment. It's about alignment. It's the universe correcting a distortion that lasted far too long. You don't need to push it forward. You just need to get out of the way. Focus on your garden. Water what feeds you. Prune what drains you. Let the seasons turn. The old energy is fading. The new rhythm is already here. And it sounds exactly like peace. Quiet. Unshakable. You've carried enough. Let the rest fall where it may. You don't owe your healing to their timeline. You don't owe your forgiveness to their regret. You only owe yourself the rest you've been postponing since day one. Close the tabs you never needed to keep open. Turn off the notifications that pull you back. Step into the light of a life built on truth. Not revenge. Not bitterness. Just clean, unapologetic freedom. They wanted a legacy. They got a quiet warning. You wanted peace. You're building one right now. The difference between you isn't what you survived. It's what you chose to do after the smoke cleared. You chose yourself. That choice echoes louder than any collapse ever will. Carry it forward. Live it loudly. Let your steady strength be the only monument you need. You didn't just make it out. You made yourself completely whole.